Hello, phenomenal story lovers. Get ready for a mind-blowing tale that proves true worth is rarely found in designer suits or million-pound deals. This one will challenge your perceptions and stay with you long after it ends. Before we dive into this breathtaking story, tell us in the comments what city you're tuning in from. And if you believe that dignity triumphs over arrogance, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives. Your support helps us share these vital stories. You can't even pronounce the wine, much less appreciate it, the millionaire sneered, amidst hushed chuckles from the table. But the waitress, poised and elegant, responded in perfect French, and then offered a toast. The room fell silent, and he, for the first time, was speechless. The morning sun streamed through the enormous windows of the Maxwell mansion, illuminating the impeccable marble floor and the artworks adorning the walls. Mark Maxwell, 36, watched the garden from his study, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His face, though handsome, held a seriousness that bordered on melancholy. The chime of the front door broke the silence. Mark let out an almost imperceptible sigh. It was time to face the day, and the responsibilities that came with being one of the city's most successful businessmen. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," greeted his butler, Alfred, as he entered the study. "The new housekeeper has arrived." Mark nodded without a word. He had been postponing hiring new staff for months, but the enormity of the house and his multiple commitments had finally forced him to concede. "Send her in, please," he finally said, his voice deep and controlled. Moments later, a 29-year-old woman entered the study. Jessica Lopez, with her brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and a modest but clean dress, presented herself to her new boss with a mix of nervousness and determination in her honey-colored eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," she greeted, her voice soft but firm. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Mark observed her for a moment, noting the dignity in her posture despite the obvious difference in their social status. There was something about her, a spark of life, that contrasted with the cold, calculated atmosphere he was accustomed to. "Welcome, Jessica," he finally replied. "Alfred will show you your responsibilities and how the house runs. I hope you're comfortable here." Jessica nodded, grateful for the opportunity. This job meant much more than just employment. It was a chance to help her family, to give her younger sister the education she deserved. As the days passed, Jessica adapted to the mansion's routine. Her hands, accustomed to hard work, moved skillfully through the household chores. But it was her heart, full of kindness and empathy, that truly began to make a difference in that place. Mark, for his part, observed the subtle changes in his home. The flowers in the vases seemed fresher. The curtains let in more light, and even the air felt lighter. However, he maintained his distance, years of distrust and disappointments weighing on his shoulders. One afternoon, while Jessica was cleaning the library, she stumbled upon a photograph hidden among the books. In it, a younger Mark smiled beside a beautiful woman. Her eyes filled with curiosity and a touch of sadness as she noticed the happiness emanating from that image, so different from the reserved man she knew. "That's private," Mark's voice startled her. He was standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of pain and anger. "I'm so sorry, sir," Jessica hastened to apologize, putting the photo back where she had found it. "I didn't mean to intrude." Mark approached and took the photograph, his fingers gently caressing the woman's face. For a moment, his mask of indifference cracked, revealing a vulnerability that moved Jessica. "She was my wife," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "She passed away 5 years ago." Jessica felt her heart clench at the obvious pain in Mark's words. Without thinking, she placed a hand on her boss's arm, a simple gesture of consolo. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Maxwell," she said sincerely. She must have been a wonderful person. Mark looked at her, surprised by the gesture and the genuine compassion in her eyes. For an instant, he felt the walls he had built around himself tremble. She was, he replied, allowing himself a small smile. She filled this place with life. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. Mark recomposed himself, returning to his usual reserved posture. However, something had changed. Jessica had glimpsed the man behind the millionaire, and that awakened in her a desire to help him sanar. The following days unfolded with a new dynamic. Although Mark remained reserved, Jessica noticed small changes. Sometimes she would catch him observing her while she worked, or hear his distant laugh when she joked with Alfred. One morning, as Jessica was arranging roses in the garden, Mark approached her. "You have a good touch with flowers," he commented, his voice softer than usual. "My wife used to say that roses are like people. They need care and patience to bloom." Jessica smiled, touched by the analogy and by the fact that Mark shared that memory with her. "It's a beautiful way to look at it, sir," she replied. "I believe all people, like roses, have the capacity to bloom. Sometimes, they just need the right environment and a little kindness." Their gazes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. There was a connection, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. The sound of the telephone broke the spell. Mark excused himself to take the call, leaving Jessica with a feeling of warmth in her chest, and the certainty that little by little, she was reaching the heart of that lonely man. What neither of them knew was that this call would mark the beginning of a series of events that would test their values, their relationship, and their ability to face their own fears and prejudices. The phone call that interrupted the moment between Mark and Jessica in the garden turned out to be more significant than either of them could imagine. Mark listened intently, his face transforming from initial surprise to an expression of determination. "I understand, David. I'll be there in an hour," he said before hanging up. Jessica, who had continued her work among the roses, couldn't help but notice the change in her boss's posture. His shoulders, normally tense, now seemed to bear an additional weight. "Is everything all right, Mr. Maxwell?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Mark looked at her, as if for a moment he had forgotten she was there. His eyes, usually distant, showed a vulnerability Jessica had never seen before. "The foundation I created in my wife's memory is facing problems," he explained, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "It seems someone has been embezzling funds." Jessica felt her heart clench at the news. She knew how important that foundation was to Mark. It was his way of keeping his wife's legacy alive. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, taking a step towards him. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Mark looked at her, surprised by her offer. For a moment, he seemed to consider the idea, but then shook his head. "Thank you, Jessica, but this is something I must handle personally," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "However, I appreciate your concern." With those words, Mark headed towards the house, leaving Jessica with a mix of worry and a growing desire to do something to help. The following days were tense in the Maxwell mansion. Mark spent long hours locked in his study, taking calls and reviewing documents. Jessica observed him from afar, noticing the dark circles that deepened under his eyes, and the way his usually erect posture began to stoop under the weight of worry. One night, while Jessica cleaned the hallway outside the study, she heard Mark's agitated voice through the half-open door. "I can't believe it, David," he exclaimed. "How could we not have noticed sooner?" There was a pause, and then Mark continued, his voice calmer, but laden with pain. "That foundation it is the last thing I have left of her. I can't let it crumble like this." Jessica stood motionless, her heart pounding. She had never heard Mark express his emotions so openly. At that moment, she made a decision. She might not be able to solve the Foundation's financial problems, but she would do everything she could to ease Mark's burden at home. The next day, Jessica woke before dawn. With determination, she prepared Mark's favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with spinach and whole wheat toast. She placed everything on a tray, along with a fresh rose from the garden, and headed to the study. She knocked softly on the door and, receiving no response, entered carefully. Mark was asleep on his desk, surrounded by papers, and with the computer still on. Jessica placed the tray on a nearby side table and gently placed a blanket over her boss's shoulders. The movement woke Mark, who blinked confusedly before fixing his gaze on Jessica. "Jessica, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. "I thought you might need a good breakfast, sir," she replied with a warm smile. "You've been working very hard." Mark looked at the tray and then at Jessica, an expression of gratitude softening his features. "Thank you," he said simply, but that word was laden with emotion. Jessica nodded and prepared to leave, but Mark's voice stopped her. "Jessica, wait," he said, sitting up. "Could you stay for a moment?" Surprised, Jessica turned to him. Mark seemed to be struggling with himself, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "Of course, sir," she replied, approaching the desk. Mark took a sip of coffee before speaking. "The Foundation was Laura's dream, my wife," he began, his voice low but firm. "She wanted to create a place where disadvantaged children could receive art education. She used to say that art could heal souls." Jessica listened attentively, moved by the passion in Mark's voice. "After her death, I set out to make that dream a reality," he continued. "And now everything is in danger because of the greed of a few." "Mr. Maxwell," Jessica said softly, "what you've achieved with that foundation is incredible. I'm sure you'll find a solution." Mark looked at her, a spark of hope illuminating his tired eyes. "Thank you, Jessica," he said. "Sometimes I forget why I started all this. Thank you for reminding me." That moment marked a turning point in Mark and Jessica's relationship. As the days passed, Mark began to trust her more, sharing his worries and seeking her opinion in matters that went beyond her domestic responsibilities. One afternoon, as they reviewed some of the Foundation's documents together, Jessica had an idea. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, hesitant at first, but gaining confidence as she spoke. "Have you considered organizing a charity event? It could be a way to raise funds and also demonstrate the Foundation's positive impact to the public." Mark looked at her, surprised, and then thoughtful. "That's an excellent idea, Jessica," he finally said, a genuine smile illuminating his face for the first time in weeks. "In fact, I think it could work." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Mark and his team immersed themselves in planning the charity event, while Jessica made sure everything in the house ran smoothly, allowing Mark to concentrate on the task at hand. One night, as Jessica served dinner, Mark surprised her with an unexpected question. "Jessica," he began, his voice a mix of nervousness and determination, "I was wondering if you'd like to accompany me to the charity event." Jessica looked at him, astonished. "Me, sir? But I don't know anything about high society events." Mark smiled, an expression that completely transformed his face. "You are the reason this event is happening, Jessica," he said sincerely. "Your compassion and your fresh perspective have been invaluable. I would be honored if you were there." Jessica felt her heart race. The idea of attending such an elegant event excited and terrified her in equal measure. But Mark's gaze, full of trust and something else she couldn't identify, convinced her. "It would be an honor, Mr. Maxwell," she replied with a shy smile. What neither of them knew at that moment was that this decision would trigger a series of events that would test not only their relationship, but also their own values and convictions. The charity event would become a stage where appearances would confront authenticity, and where Jessica would have the opportunity to prove that true nobility does not reside in titles or wealth, but in the heart. Mark's invitation to Jessica to attend the charity event had left the young woman in a whirlwind of emotions. As she distractedly wiped the window frames in the main living room, her mind wandered between excitement and nervousness. The reflection of the sun on the freshly polished glass reminded her of the sparkle of evening gowns she had only seen in magazines and TV shows. "Everything all right, Jessica?" Alfred's voice, the butler, pulled her from her thoughts. "You've been cleaning the same spot for 5 minutes." Jessica blushed, realizing her distraction. "I'm sorry, Alfred. It's just that—" She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Maxwell has invited me to the charity event." Alfred's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Well, that's unusual," he commented, carefully choosing his words. "I know," Jessica replied, biting her lower lip. "I have no idea how to behave at such an event. And what am I going to wear?" she added, looking at her simple work uniform. Alfred observed her with a mix of sympathy and concern. He knew well the world Jessica was about to enter, and knew it could be as dazzling as it was ruthless. "Don't worry so much, Jessica," he finally said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Just be yourself. It's what Mr. Maxwell appreciates about you." His words, though kind, did not completely dispel Jessica's anxiety. That night, as she prepared dinner, she couldn't help but feel observed. Mark, who usually dined in his study, had decided to do so in the main dining room. Jessica called Mark's name as she was about to leave after serving the main course. "Could you join me for a moment?" With a racing heart, Jessica approached the table. Mark was looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "I know the invitation to the event can be overwhelming," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I want you to know that you're not obligated to attend if you feel uncomfortable." Jessica felt a pang of disappointment. Was he regretting inviting her? "No, Mr. Maxwell," she replied with more firmness than she felt. "I want to go, it's just that—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not sure I fit into that world." Mark looked at her intently, as if seeing beyond her exterior. "Jessica, your presence at that event is more valuable than you think," he finally said. "You represent everything the Foundation stands for, the opportunity to grow, to overcome circumstances." Mark's words resonated deeply with Jessica. For the first time, she realized that her role at the event went beyond being a mere companion. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell," she replied, a new determination shining in her eyes. "I'll do my best." Mark nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "I'm sure you will," he said. And then, as if remembering something important, he added, "Oh, and Jessica, I've arranged an appointment for you tomorrow. A stylist will come to the house to help you prepare for the event." Jessica looked at him in surprise. "But sir, I can't accept." "I insist," Mark gently interrupted her. "Consider it part of your work for the Foundation." The next day, the Maxwell mansion became a hive of activity. The stylist, an elegant woman named Carmen, arrived early with a retinue of assistants and several suitcases full of dresses and accessories. Jessica felt like a doll as Carmen and her team styled her hair, applied her makeup, and dressed her. She tried on several dresses, each more beautiful than the last, but none seemed to completely convince Carmen. "No, no, no," the stylist murmured, shaking her head. "We need something that reflects your presence, my dear. Something that makes you shine without overshadowing your authenticity." Finally, Carmen pulled out a dress that made Jessica gasp. It was a deep blue, like the night sky, with subtle sparkles that resembled distant stars. The cut was elegant, but not ostentatious, enhancing Jessica's figure without being uncomfortable. "This is it," Carmen declared with a triumphant smile. "This dress tells your story, Jessica. It speaks of dreams and determination." When Jessica looked in the mirror, she could barely recognize herself. The dress, the delicately swept-up hairstyle, the makeup that highlighted her natural features, everything combined to create an image that was both elegant and authentic. "You look beautiful," Mark's voice startled her. She hadn't realized he had entered the room. Jessica turned, feeling her cheeks flush under her boss's intense gaze. Mark observed her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she couldn't identify. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "And thank you for all this. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Mark approached, his expression serious but warm. "You don't have to repay me anything, Jessica. Your presence at the event, your dedication to the foundation, that's more valuable than any dress or jewel." A silence heavy with emotion filled the room. Jessica felt her heart pounding, aware of Mark's closeness and the intensity of his gaze. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, gathering courage. "Can I ask you a question?" Mark nodded, expectant. "Why me?" Jessica asked. "Why invite me to the event? There are so many more suitable people, more from your world." Mark seemed to consider his answer carefully. "Because you, Jessica, represent everything my wife, Laura, valued," he finally said. "Authenticity, compassion, the ability to see beauty in simplicity. In a world of appearances, you are real." Mark's words touched something deep within Jessica. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that there was something more behind those words, something that went beyond the admiration of a boss for his employee. "Thank you," she simply replied, aware that any other word might break the delicate balance of the moment. Mark nodded, as if he understood about everything Jessica wasn't saying. "The event is tomorrow night," he said, returning to his professional tone. "Are you ready?" Jessica took a deep breath, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. "I will be," she affirmed with a determined smile. As Mark left, Jessica looked at herself in the mirror again. She no longer saw just the housekeeper of the Maxwell mansion. She saw a strong woman, capable of facing new challenges. The charity event would be more than a gala. It would be an opportunity to prove her worth, not only to others, but to herself. What Jessica didn't know was that that night would not only change her life, but also test her values, her relationship with Mark, and the world's perception of both of them. The stage was set for an encounter that would shake the foundations of high society and reveal hidden truths beneath layers of luxury and appearances. The morning of the event dawned with a clear sky, as if the universe itself wanted to bless the charity gala. Jessica woke before dawn, her heart beating with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The navy blue dress hung in her closet, a silent promise of the transformation to come. As she prepared breakfast for Mark, her hands trembled slightly. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the perfume of the fresh roses she had placed in a vase in the center of the table. "Good morning, Jessica." Mark's voice startled her. He stood in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in an impeccable gray suit. "I see you're up early." Jessica turned, offering him a nervous smile. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell. Yes, I wanted to make sure everything was ready for today." Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the immaculate kitchen and lingering on the roses. A shadow of emotion crossed his face, so quickly that Jessica almost thought she had imagined it. "The roses," Mark murmured, approaching the vase. Laura always said there was no better way to start the day than with the scent of fresh roses. Jessica felt her heart clench at the mention of Laura. Despite the month she had been working at the mansion, the presence of Mark's late wife still lingered in every corner. "Mr. Maxwell," Jessica began, gathering courage. "May I ask you something about Mrs. Laura?" Mark looked at her, surprised by the question, but nodded slowly. "What was she like at events like tonight's?" Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark sat at the table, his eyes lost in memories. "Laura, she lit up every room she entered," he finally said, a melancholic smile curving his lips. "It wasn't just her beauty. It was her way of making every person feel special, valued. At charity events, she spoke with the same warmth to a CEO as to a waiter." Jessica listened attentively, imagining the woman who had left such a deep mark on Mark and on everyone who knew her. "She sounds like a wonderful person," Jessica said sincerely. "She was," Mark replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "And you know, Jessica, I see a lot of her in you. That same compassion, that ability to see the best in people." Mark's words made Jessica's heart flutter. Did he really see her like that? As someone comparable to the woman he had loved so much? I don't know what to say, Mr. Maxwell," Jessica stammered, feeling her cheeks flush. Mark stood up, approaching her. For a moment, Jessica thought he was going to take her hands, but instead, he simply nodded as if he had made an internal decision. "Tonight, Jessica, I want you to remember this," Mark said, his voice firm but kind. "You are not just there as my companion. You are representing the heart of the foundation, the values Laura fought for. Be yourself, and you will shine brighter than any jewel in that room." Mark's words resonated in Jessica throughout the day as she prepared for the event. Every time anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the confidence Mark had placed in her. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, Jessica found herself in front of her bedroom mirror. The navy blue dress fit her figure perfectly, the subtle sparkles catching the light like distant stars. Her hair, tied back in an elegant low bun, exposed her neck, where a delicate silver necklace, a loan from Laura's collection, as Mark had told her, completed the ensemble. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," Jessica said, turning to see Alfred, the butler, set to enter. "Miss Jessica," Alfred said with a paternal smile, "Mr. Maxwell is waiting for you in the foyer." Jessica took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Thank you, Alfred. I'm coming." Before leaving, Alfred paused, looking at her with a mix of pride and concern. "Remember, Miss Jessica," he said softly, "you belong there as much as anyone. Don't let anyone make you feel less." The butler's words gave Jessica the final boost of confidence she needed. With her head held high, she left her room and headed to the foyer. Mark was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs, impeccably dressed in a black tuxedo that accentuated his athletic figure. When he saw her descend, his eyes widened in awe, an expression of admiration illuminating his usually serious face. "Jessica," Mark said when she reached the last step, "you look dazzling." "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell," Jessica replied, feeling her cheeks blush. "You look very elegant, too." For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, an invisible current of energy passing between them. Finally, Mark offered his arm to Jessica. "Are you ready?" he asked with an encouraging smile. Jessica took his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his suit. "As ready as I can be," she replied with a nervous laugh. As they left the mansion towards the waiting limousine, Jessica couldn't help but feel she was on the verge of something big, something that would change her life forever. What she didn't know was how true that intuition would turn out to be. The journey to the event passed in a comfortable silence, occasionally interrupted by Mark, who gave Jessica some final tips about the guests and the event's protocol. "Remember," Mark said as the limousine approached its destination, "tonight you are not my employee. You are my guest of honor, the person who has been instrumental in making this event a reality." Jessica nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude towards this man who had placed so much trust in her. "I won't let you down, Mr. Maxwell," she promised. "I know you won't," Mark replied with a warm smile. "And Jessica, for tonight, call me Mark, all right?" Before Jessica could reply, the limousine stopped. Through the tinted window, she could see camera flashes and a crowd of elegantly dressed people ascending a marble staircase. "Ready?" Mark asked once more, his hand on the door handle. Jessica took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "Ready," she replied, surprised by the firmness of her own voice. With a final exchange of glances, Mark opened the door, and together they emerged into the dazzling light of the flashes and the expectant murmur of the crowd. The night that would change their lives had just begun. The Imperial Hotel's event hall shimmered under the light of hundreds of crystal chandeliers. The crème de la crème of society gathered in small groups, the clinking of champagne glasses mingling with the murmur of refined conversations. The air was charged with anticipation, as if everyone knew that this night would be different from any other charity gala. Mark and Jessica made their entrance, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. All eyes turned to them, some curious, others surprised, and a few clearly disapproving. Jessica felt her heart pound, but Mark's steady hand on her back gave her the courage to hold her head high. "Breathe, Jessica," Mark whispered, leaning slightly towards her. "Remember, you have as much right to be here as any of them." Jessica imperceptibly nodded, grateful for the support. As they moved through the room, she noticed how people parted to let them pass, as if they were royalty. It was a strange feeling for someone who, until recently, was used to moving invisibly among the rich and powerful. "Mark, darling," a honeyed voice broke the silence. An elegant woman in her 50s approached them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a lovely surprise. I didn't know you'd bring company tonight." "Good evening, Victoria," Mark replied with cold courtesy. "I'd like to introduce you to Jessica Lopez. Jessica, this is Victoria Hayes, president of the Charity Events Committee." Jessica extended her hand, striving to maintain a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hayes." Victoria took Jessica's hand delicately, as if afraid of catching something. "The pleasure is all mine, dear. Tell me, how did you meet our dear Mark?" Before Jessica could answer, Mark intervened. "Jessica has been fundamental in organizing this event. Her fresh perspective and dedication have been invaluable to the foundation." Victoria arched a perfectly defined eyebrow. "Oh, really? How interesting. Well, if you'll excuse me, I must attend to the other guests." As Victoria walked away, Jessica exhaled the breath she didn't know she was holding. "That was intense," she murmured. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. "You did very well. Victoria can be challenging, but don't let her intimidate you. Remember why we're here." As the night progressed, Jessica found herself navigating a sea of new faces and complex conversations. To her surprise, she discovered she could keep up better than she expected. Her years of observing from the shadows had given her a unique understanding of this world, and now, being in the spotlight, she could use that knowledge to her advantage. At one point, she found herself conversing with a group of businessmen about the Foundation's initiatives. At first, their skeptical glances made her nervous, But as she spoke, she noticed their expressions change from doubt to interest. "You see," Jessica explained, her voice gaining confidence with each word, "what makes our foundation unique is its focus on individual potential. It's not just about providing resources, but about creating opportunities for people to discover and develop their talents." One of the businessmen, a stern-looking man, looked at her curiously. "That's an interesting approach, Miss Lopez. But how do you measure the success of something so subjective?" Jessica smiled, internally grateful for the long conversations she had had with Mark on this topic. "Excellent question, Mr. Evans," she replied confidently. "We use a multidimensional approach to measure our impact. Of course, we have traditional indicators like employment rates and educational attainment of our beneficiaries, but we go beyond that." She paused for a moment, making sure she had everyone's attention. "We work with psychologists and sociologists to evaluate the overall well-being and life satisfaction of the people we support. We measure things like self-esteem, resilience, long-term planning ability. Because, you see, true success is not just measured in money earned, but in lives transformed." Her words seemed to strike a chord with the group. Even Mr. Evans, known for his toughness in business, seemed impressed. "That's an interesting approach," he admitted. "But it must be costly and complex to implement." "It is," Jessica assented. "But we believe it's worth every penny and every hour invested. Because when you invest in a person, it doesn't just change their life, but that of their entire family and community. It's a ripple effect of hope and opportunity." The conversation continued, with Jessica answering questions and sharing anecdotes about the Foundation's programs. Without realizing it, she was planting seeds of change in some of the city's most influential businessmen. From his position, Mark observed the scene with a mix of admiration and something deeper he dared not name. Seeing Jessica, so confident and passionate, talking about the Foundation as if it were her own, awakened emotions in him he thought were forgotten. "She's impressive, isn't she?" a voice said beside him. Mark turned to find David, his right-hand man at the Foundation. "She is," Mark replied, unable to hide the pride in his voice. David looked at him with a knowing smile. "You know, Mark, I haven't seen you this animated at an event since Laura." The mention of his late wife made Mark tense momentarily. But to his surprise, the usual pain was replaced by a feeling of warmth, as if Laura somehow approved of what was happening. "Jessica has that effect on people," he said simply. Meanwhile, Jessica had excused herself from the group and was heading towards the balcony, needing a moment to breathe. The fresh night air was a welcome relief after the heat and intensity of the room. "You're doing incredibly well," Mark's voice startled her slightly. She turned to see him approaching, an expression of evident pride on his face. "Thank you," Jessica replied, feeling her cheeks flush. "It's overwhelming, but somehow exciting." Mark stood beside her, both looking out at the illuminated city. "You know, Jessica, when I invited you tonight, I knew you'd be a great representative of the Foundation, but you've exceeded all my expectations." Jessica looked at him, moved by the sincerity in his voice. "All of this is thanks to you, Mark. The trust you've placed in me." "No," Mark gently interrupted her. "It's all your merit, your compassion, your intelligence, your ability to connect with people. That's all yours, Jessica." For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, the tension between them palpable. Jessica felt her heart pound, aware of Mark's closeness and the intensity of his gaze. But before either of them could say anything more, a sharp scream broke the moment. From inside the room, a growing commotion could be heard. "What's happening?" Jessica asked, alarmed. Mark frowned, his expression changing to one of concern. I don't know, but we'd better find out. Together, they hurried back to the room, unaware that they were about to face a challenge that would test not only the foundation, but also their relationship and everything they believed in. Mark and Jessica hurried back into the hall, the echo of their footsteps resonating on the polished marble floor of the corridor. The rising murmur of agitated voices intensified as they approached. As they crossed the threshold, the scene unfolding before them was a contained chaos. Like a storm about to break in full fury. In the center of the hall, surrounded by a circle of astonished guests, stood Victoria Hayes. Her usually imperturbable face was contorted into a grimace of fury and indignation. In front of her, visibly trembling, was a young waitress, her large, frightened eyes fixed on the floor. "How dare you!" Victoria thundered, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? It's an original Valentino." Jessica observed the scene, noticing the dark stain spreading across the front of Victoria's dress. At the waitress's feet, the remains of a glass of red wine lay scattered on the silk carpet. I'm so sorry, madam," the waitress stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "An accident?" Victoria interrupted, her laugh humorless. "Your incompetence has cost me more than you'll earn in your entire life. You should be grateful to have a job, though you clearly don't deserve it." Jessica felt something ignite within her. Victoria's words, laden with contempt and superiority, brought back memories of her own struggles, of the times she had been belittled for her humble origins. Without a second thought, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hayes," Jessica said, her voice clear and firm, resonating in the sudden silence that had fallen over the hall. "I'm sure this can be resolved in a more civilized manner." All eyes turned to her. Jessica could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes evaluating her, judging her. But she stood firm, like an oak tree against the storm. Victoria looked at her with a mix of surprise and disdain. "And who do you think you are to intervene? This is none of your business, dear." Jessica took a deep breath, feeling Mark's hand on her back, offering silent support. "My name is Jessica Lopez, and I am part of the Maxwell Foundation team, and I believe that everything that happens at this event is our business, especially when it comes to treating people with dignity and respect." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some guests exchanged astonished glances, others approving ones. Victoria, for her part, seemed to have been slapped. "Dignity? Respect?" Victoria spat. This girl has ruined my dress and potentially the entire evening. And you talk about respect?" Jessica took another step forward, her voice soft but full of conviction. "A dress can be cleaned, Mrs. Hayes, but words and actions can leave scars that last a lifetime. Isn't that precisely what we are trying to change with events like this? Aren't we here to build a more just and compassionate world?" The silence that followed her words was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Jessica could feel her heart pounding in her ears, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on Victoria. It was then that Mark stepped forward, placing himself beside Jessica. "Victoria," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Jessica is right. This event is not just about raising funds, but about demonstrating the values we uphold. Allow me." He took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to Victoria with a polite smile. "For the dress," he explained. "And as for the young woman," he turned to the still trembling waitress, "I'm sure it was an accident. Perhaps you could take a break to recover from the shock." The waitress nodded gratefully, quickly moving away. Victoria, for her part, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Finally, with an exaggerated sigh, she took the handkerchief. "I suppose you're right, Mark," she said, forcing a smile. Perhaps I overreacted. Jessica watched as the tension in the room began to dissipate. The guests slowly returned to their conversations, though many still cast curious glances in her direction. "That was impressive," Mark murmured, leaning towards Jessica. Not many people would have dared to confront Victoria like that. Jessica felt her cheeks flush. "I couldn't stay silent," she replied softly. "Not after everything we've talked about regarding the Foundation's values." Mark looked at her with a mix of admiration and something deeper, something that made Jessica's heart flutter. "You know," he said, "every time I think you can't surprise me anymore, you do something like this." Before Jessica could reply, David approached them, his face illuminated by a wide smile. "That was magnificent," he exclaimed. "Jessica, you've just become the hero of the night. People can't stop talking about your intervention." Jessica felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I just did what I thought was right," she murmured. "And that," Mark said, "is exactly what we needed tonight. Jessica, I think it's the perfect time for you to give your speech." My speech?" Jessica stammered, feeling panic seize her. "But I thought you would give the main speech." Mark shook his head, a warm smile illuminating his face. "After what just happened, there's no one better than you to talk about the Foundation's values. Trust me, Jessica, you can do it." Jessica looked around, noticing how the guests observed her with a mix of curiosity and respect. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, a burning determination, a desire to use this opportunity to make a real difference. "All right," she finally said, straightening her shoulders. "I'll do it." As Mark guided her to the small stage at the end of the hall, Jessica felt she was about to cross a threshold. What she said in the next few minutes would not only define the event's success, but could also change the course of her life and that of many others. With each step, the murmurs in the hall faded, anticipation grew, and Jessica prepared to face the biggest challenge of her life. The Imperial Hotel ballroom, once a hive of murmurs and stifled laughter, fell into an expectant silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on Jessica as she ascended the small stage, the rustle of her navy blue dress against the marble floor echoing like a whisper in the quietness. Jessica felt the weight of every gaze, as if they were tiny needles pressing against her skin. Her heart pounded so hard she feared everyone in the room could hear it. However, upon reaching the podium, something within her shifted. The anxiety that had been bubbling in her stomach transformed into a burning determination. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes briefly meeting Mark's. In his gaze, she found confidence, support, and something more. Something that made her heart flutter for reasons completely different from nervousness. She took a deep breath, the scent of roses permeating the air filling her lungs. It was as if Laura, Mark's late wife, were there, giving her strength. "Good evening, everyone," Jessica began, her voice surprisingly firm. "My name is Jessica Lopez, and until recently, my job was to keep the Maxwell Mansion immaculate." A murmur rippled through the room. Some guests exchanged surprised glances, others of thinly veiled disdain. Jessica continued, ignoring the reactions. "I know what you're thinking. What is a mere housekeeper doing speaking at an event like this? The truth is, I've asked myself the same question hundreds of times in the past few weeks." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. She looked at Victoria Hayes, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She looked at the young waitress she had defended, now standing in a corner, listening intently. "But tonight, I'm not here as an employee. I'm here as someone who has witnessed firsthand the transformative power of compassion and opportunity." Jessica began to tell her story, her voice gaining strength with every word. She spoke of her childhood in a marginalized neighborhood, of her mother's sacrifices so she could study, of the obstacles she had to overcome. When I arrived at the Maxwell mansion, I thought my job would simply be to clean and tidy. But Mr. Mark saw something in me that even I didn't know existed. He gave me the opportunity to grow, to learn, to contribute to something bigger than myself. Her words resonated in the hall, captivating the audience. Even those who had initially looked at her with skepticism now listened attentively. The Maxwell Foundation is not just about giving money or resources. It's about seeing the potential in every person, regardless of their origin or circumstances. It's about building bridges between worlds that often seem irreconcilable. Jessica paused, her eyes meeting those of the waitress she had defended earlier. Moments ago, we witnessed an unfortunate incident, but instead of seeing a crisis, I saw an opportunity. An opportunity to demonstrate that the values we preach are not just pretty words in a brochure, but principles by which we live. Victoria Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Jessica noticed that there was no longer hostility in her gaze, but a mix of shame and reflection. Each of us, regardless of our position or wealth, has the power to make a difference. It can be something as simple as a kind word, a helping hand, an opportunity offered to someone others might overlook. Jessica felt her voice tremble slightly, emotion threatening to overflow, but she stood firm, determined to convey her message. True nobility does not reside in titles or bank accounts. It resides in how we treat others, especially those whom society considers less important. Her eyes met Mark's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to vanish. She saw in his gaze pride, admiration, and something deeper, something that made her heart beat. Mr. Maxwell gave me an opportunity that changed my life. And that is what the Maxwell Foundation seeks to do for thousands of people. It's not just charity. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to shine, to reach their full potential. Jessica paused, letting her words sink into the audience. The silence in the hall was absolute, laden with emotion and reflection. Tonight, I ask you to join us in this mission, not just with your donations, though of course they are welcome and necessary, but with your actions. I challenge you to look beyond appearances, to lend a hand to someone who might surprise you. Because believe me, the potential for greatness exists in the most unexpected places. Jessica ended her speech with a warm and sincere smile. For a moment, the silence persisted, as if the audience were processing everything they had heard. And then, like a wave that starts slowly and gains strength, the applause erupted. It was a deafening applause, full of emotion and admiration. Jessica saw tears in the eyes of some guests, smiles of approval in others. Mark approached her, taking her hand in a gesture of unity and support. Together, he said, his voice mingling with Jessica's, we will take the Maxwell Foundation to new heights. Thank you all for your continued support. As they descended from the stage, they were immediately surrounded by guests, eager to congratulate Jessica and ask questions about the Foundation's future plans. Jessica found herself navigating these conversations with an ease that surprised her, her passion for the Foundation's mission shining through every word. In a moment of calm, Jessica found herself in front of Victoria Hayes. The woman who hours earlier had looked at her with disdain now observed her with a mix of respect and regret. Miss Lopez, Victoria began, her voice devoid of its usual condescending tone. I must offer you my most sincere apologies for my previous behavior. You have demonstrated tonight a grace and wisdom that many of us, with all our privileges, often forget. Jessica smiled, extending her hand. There's nothing to forgive, Mrs. Hayes. We're all here to learn and grow together. Victoria took her hand, a genuine smile illuminating her face. "I hope we can work together in the future. The Maxwell Foundation is lucky to have you." As the night progressed, Jessica found herself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions and new possibilities. Every conversation, every handshake, every exchanged smile brought her closer to the realization that her life had changed irrevocably. And amidst it all, there was Mark. Their gazes met across the room, sharing complicit smiles and moments of silent understanding. Jessica felt that something had changed between them, a new dimension in their relationship that went beyond employer and employee, even beyond partners in a noble cause. As the gala came to an end, Jessica realized that this was not the end of her story, but just the beginning. A new chapter was opening before her, full of challenges and possibilities, and she was ready to face it with all the strength and determination that had brought her this far. The dawn filtered softly through the silk curtains of the Maxwell mansion, bathing the study in a golden light. Jessica, sitting at the mahogany desk she now shared with Mark, watched the waking city. The streets, once empty, began to fill with life, a constant reminder of the work that lay ahead. 6 months had passed since that night at the Imperial Hotel. 6 months of dizzying changes and unexpected challenges. Jessica idly caressed the edge of a folder full of proposals for new foundation programs. Her reflection in the window glass showed a transformed woman, not only in appearance, but in essence. The sound of familiar footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Mark entered the study, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. "Good morning," he greeted with a warm smile, placing one of the cups in front of Jessica. "Ready for another day of changing the world?" Jessica chuckled softly, accepting the coffee with a nod. "Always," she replied, her eyes meeting Mark's. "Though sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. All this seems too good to be true." Mark sat on the edge of the desk, his gaze serious but full of affection. "It's not a dream, Jessica. You've earned it with your effort and dedication. These past few months have been extraordinary." Jessica nodded, remembering the challenges they had faced. The transition hadn't been easy. There was resistance from some board members, skeptical of the idea that an ex-housekeeper could lead the foundation. There were nights of endless work, tense meetings, and moments of doubt. But there were also triumphs. The scholarship program Jessica had proposed, based on her own experience, was changing lives. Success stories began to accumulate. Young people from marginalized neighborhoods accessing higher education. Single mothers starting their own businesses. Entire communities transforming, thanks to the foundation's support. "Do you remember Maria?" Jessica asked, a smile lighting up her face. "The young woman we met at the community clinic last month." Mark nodded, his expression softening as he recalled. "The medical student who almost dropped out due to financial problems. I received an email from her this morning," Jessica continued, her voice laden with emotion. "She passed all her exams. She says our scholarship not only saved her career, but it gave her hope back." Mark leaned in, taking Jessica's hand in his. "That's what you do, Jessica. You bring back hope. You did it with me. You do it with everyone the foundation touches." The contact sent an electric current through Jessica's body. The relationship between them had evolved in recent months, deepening into something that went beyond friendship or professional collaboration. There was a tacit understanding, a connection that grew day by day. "Mark," Jessica began, her voice barely a whisper, "there's something I've wanted to tell you." The sound of the phone interrupted them. Mark answered, his expression changing from frustration to interest as he listened. "I understand. Yes, we'll be there. Thank you for letting me know." He hung up, turning to Jessica with a mix of emotion and concern. It's from the hospital. Victoria Hayes had an accident this morning. She's stable, but Jessica stood up immediately. We must go see her. Mark nodded, a smile of pride and affection illuminating his face. I knew you'd say that. The drive to the hospital passed in a comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Jessica remembered how her relationship with Victoria had evolved since that night at the Imperial Hotel. The woman who had once looked at her with disdain had become an invaluable ally, using her connections to open doors that had previously seemed insurmountable for the Foundation. Upon reaching the hospital room, they found Victoria awake, her usual elegance contrasting with the austerity of the hospital bed. Her face lit up when she saw them. "Jessica, Mark," she greeted, her voice weak but full of warmth. "You didn't have to come." "Of course we did," Jessica replied, approaching to take Victoria's hand. "We're family, remember?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Family," she repeated, savoring the word. "You know, Jessica, when I met you, I thought you were an intruder in our world. How wrong I was. You have taught us the true meaning of nobility." Mark approached, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "Victoria is right. You've changed our lives, Jessica. Mine more than anyone's." Jessica felt her heart race at Mark's words. She turned to look at him, finding in his eyes an emotion that mirrored her own. Victoria watched them with a knowing smile. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she exclaimed, with a hint of her old dramatic flair. "When are you going to admit what we all already know?" Jessica and Mark looked at each other, a nervous laugh escaping their lips. "Victoria," Mark began, but the woman interrupted him with a wave of her hand. "Life is too short for what-ifs, my dears," Victoria said. "Believe me, I know better than anyone right now. Don't waste the time you have." Victoria's words acted as a catalyst. Mark took Jessica's hands in his eyes searching hers. "Jessica," he said softly, "these months working together, seeing your passion, your compassion, have made me realize something that I think I've known since that night on the balcony." Jessica held her breath, her heart pounding. "What thing?" she asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. "That I love you," Mark said simply. "Not just as a colleague or friend. I love you for who you are, for how you have illuminated my life and that of so many others." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, a mix of joy and relief flooding her being. "I love you too, Mark Maxwell," she replied, her voice broken with emotion. "I've been afraid to admit it, to change what we had, but love isn't something to be feared," Mark completed, pulling her closer. Their lips met in a soft, sweet kiss. Years of longing and mutual understanding crystallized in a moment of perfect synchronicity. The sound of applause separated them. Victoria watched them with a radiant smile, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "It's about time," she said, laughing softly. "Now go. You have a world to change together." Jessica and Mark left the hospital hand in hand, the future stretching before them like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the bright colors of hope and love. The story that had begun with a millionaire inviting his employee to a luxurious event had evolved into something much deeper and more meaningful. A partnership based on mutual respect, a shared passion for helping others, and a love that transcended social barriers. As they walked towards the car, Jessica paused, looking at Mark with a smile. "You know what? I think I have an idea for a new foundation program." Mark chuckled, recognizing the familiar sparkle in Jessica's eyes. "Of course you do. Tell me all about it." And so, amidst laughter and plans for the future, Jessica and Mark embarked on the next chapter of their lives, ready to face any challenge destiny might present, as long as they did it together. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to keep seeing more stories like this, and tell us in the comments what part touched your heart and what rating you give it from 0 to 10. Thanks for joining us to the end.